Hi everyone, today I'll be presenting my lecture on my UNESCO site, which is called Bikini Atoll Nuclear Testing Site. So let me just go to my presentation. And this is my source, and that's me. So my objectives are included here, which is students will gain knowledge on the geographic location and the events that took place at the Bikini Atoll nuclear testing site. Students will be able to identify the dawn of the nuclear age, and students will understand the effects of atomic warfare. Students will also demonstrate the knowledge on the events that took place during the Cold War. So to begin, this is the Bikini Atoll nuclear test site, and it was created in the wake of World War II in close relation to the beginnings of the Cold War. The US decided to recommence nuclear testing in the Pacific Ocean on Bikini Atoll, which is located on the Marshall Archipelago, which is a group of ice-covered islands found off the shelf of Antarctica. And approximately 67 nuclear tests were carried out from the years of 1946 to 1958, including the drop of the first H bomb in 1952. And this specific testing site reveals the extreme power of nuclear warfare in relation to the Cold War, since this was arguably the largest threat of this era. And ships at this testing site were sent to the bottom of the lagoon by tests that occurred in 1946 in relation to the Bravo crater, and this was equivalent to 7,000 times the Hiroshima bomb. These tests had major consequences on the natural environment of Bikini Atoll. So if you look at this photo, you can see there's a scuba diver exploring the underwater of the Bikini Atoll nuclear testing site, and you can see one of the huge ships that were sank. And the extreme violence that took place in this area showed that mankind was entering a nuclear era, and the political and military personnel involved noted this area marks the beginning of the Cold War and the race to develop weapons of mass destruction. And so events that took place here had detrimental effects on the terrestrial and also the underwater landscape of Bikini Atoll. And they also led to the development of international movements moving for nuclear disarmament. So the beliefs and ideas associated with escalation of military power draws a parallel between Bikini Atoll test site and the Cold War. So next I'll be speaking about a book that I found during my research for this. And this book is called International Power and International Relations: Essays in Honor of Coral Bell. So it speaks on Coral Bell, she was an individual from Australia, and she states that the Cold War was a state of political hostility between countries that included propaganda, threats, and measures of short open warfare, and this occurred between the Soviet bloc countries and the US Western powers from 1945 to 1990. And George Kennan was an advocate of containment policy of Soviet expansion during the Cold War, and he was an American diplomat who's mentioned in this text. And he said that even though he was a diplomat and worked for the US government, he was actually kept in the dark about the extent of America's nuclear and military strength. So even individuals who worked within the government were kept in the dark. So you can imagine how regular citizens felt during this time. And Coral Bell speaks about whether democracies in an alliance are able to muster the will, strength, and flexibility to conquer individuals under an authoritarian coalition. So she was really just touching on if it was even possible for capitalist countries to defeat this communist rule in the Soviet Union. And at this point in time, it looked pretty bleak. So she also touches on the first decade of the Cold War that began on either side of Eurasia, first in Berlin and then in Korea. And the second decade, the Soviet bloc really started to gain momentum. And then during the third decade, the initiative shifted towards Western countries due to the failing economies of places like Germany and Japan. So this really showed the beginning of the fall of communism because capitalist economies were really outperforming Soviet economies. And throughout this chapter, Bell touches on the radicalism that took place during this era as well. And the nuclear testing that occurred in Bikini Atoll is a prime example of the extreme lengths these fears took people to. So, next, I'll be touching on a journal article which is called Conflict and Cooperation in the Cold War: New Directions in Contemporary Historical Research. So this article focuses on the duration of the Cold War. It also focuses on reasons why the Cold War began and implications of this crisis as well. So Leaders like Joseph Stalin and Leonid Brezhnev felt a strong need to exercise power over distant geographies, which means that they didn't just want to um, be in charge of their own countries. They wanted to expand their beliefs and views and rule over already other sovereign countries over the in throughout the world, basically. So um, the Cold War that lasted about 45 years and constant power struggle among nations led to the development of extreme political and military strategy of nuclear warfare. So this just shows JFK or John F. Kennedy, and it also shows the Soviet leader, which was, excuse me, Joseph Stalin. And then here is a little picture of the Cold War, and it shows non-aligned countries and areas. It shows Eastern Bloc areas and alliances, and then it shows Western Bloc alliances. So I thought that was an interesting photo to include, just so you can have a visual of who was involved. And then this next slide really talks about containment strategies due to a fear of atomic warfare. So these were used to decrease expansion of Soviet power, and extreme anxiety occurred as a result of nuclear threats. So fresh off the ending of World War II, President Harry Truman, which he's on this next slide, he did not have a long time to celebrate the ending of World War II because during this time, the war alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union collapsed, and this collapse proved to be extremely problematic. So the Soviet bloc was present in Western Europe and was set in place. There was a looming threat of international communism. So these sources and this information was found in the Lualdi textbook. So I just wanted to insert that really quick. And Truman strategized to combat the expansion of Soviet power. And while he was strategizing the combating the expansion, he came up with containment strategies. So containment strategies really included keeping the communism and the communist beliefs, basically keeping them over there. So there's a quote from the Lualdi book that I thought was really interesting, and it says, "One seeks by all means short of war to block further expansion of Soviet power, expose the falsities of Soviet pretensions, induce a retraction of the Kremlin's control and influence in general, so foster the seeds of destruction within the Soviet system, and that the Kremlin is brought at least to the point of modifying its behavior to conform to generally accepted international standards." So this quote really touches on the fact that the Soviet Union was trying to expand communism, and the US was trying to contain it by any means other than war. They were trying not to take it there because they had already just came out of World War II. So I thought that was really interesting to enter as well, and something that's important to know and to pay attention to when learning about the Cold War and Bikini Atoll and in relation to testing nuclear weapons and nuclear warfare. So President John F. Kennedy actually published a piece in Life magazine outlining what citizens should do in the event of a nuclear attack. And this included instructions on finding adequate shelter and what items these shelters would hold. So it had a lot of details, and this further demonstrates the fear of nuclear warfare. And Soviets had facilities similar to Bikini Atoll in which they tested extremely dangerous military grade nuclear weapons set in place to attack the US if they decided to wage war against communism. So, in conclusion, I would like to wrap things up by touching on the extreme lethality of nuclear weapons. And the atomic bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 killed thousands of people instantly. And this bomb was not designed to harm political leaders or adult men, it was designed to kill an entire population, which included women and children. And the expansion of communism led to threats of nuclear warfare yet again, and US authorities had no idea of the extent or possible existence of the weapons that the Soviet Union were withholding. And while this war was fought between many free countries and a large communist union, the tension between the US and Soviet Union was extremely palpable. So I thought that was really interesting to touch on as well, and important to note that while this war was fought um, throughout many years and with many countries involved, the US and the Soviet Union developed a ton of nuclear weapons and these threats were occurring. They were extremely large threats that were occurring. So in places like Bikini Atoll, where these were developed, it had extreme repercussions. So that is an important thing to note as well. And I think that's everything that I would like to touch on. So I'd like to wrap up my presentation here. And thank you for listening.